Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video. In this video we're continuing on with my Big Brother Top 10 series here. Now obviously we already did the top 10 non-winning one-time players of all time. We also did the top 10 non-winning players of all time. So here let's wrap up this little series here by doing the top 10 one-time players of all time. So obviously, as I said, I already did the non-winning one-time player list. This list will just be that list but adding in the winning players that have only played one time as of BB22. So with the honorable mentions here, we are essentially going to be talking about every winner that didn't end up making the list here. Now, if you want to see the honorable mentions that are non-winning one-time players, I recommend you go back to that video. So with the honorable mentions here, there's only actually 5 people to even talk about. So let's just run through them in chronological order. First person that did not make the list was Lisa. And Lisa was definitely in consideration. I think the thing about Lisa is that I do look at her as a very good social player. She is someone that was able to easily get along with the majority of the house. I mean, she wins that wheel of first impressions right away. She was obviously the most playable option by the time of the end game, to where I do feel like she probably wins a jury vote against anybody. She also started to get the game a bit more towards the back portions of the game. I mean, her not voting Eric back into the game, I think really showed her recognizing her position within the game. I do think she still lacks a bit of a killer instinct in the grand scheme of things. I do think she kind of just allowed herself to be dragged by Jason and Danielle when there were definitely opportunities for her to better her position moving into that end game, specifically with trying to get rid of Jason earlier on. Though to be fair, she never really had the opportunity to do so. And she was competent enough in competition. She was good enough strategically, and she was good socially. Though at the same time, she was kind of on the outskirts of the game in that middle portion of the game and was almost voted out by her own alliance, which is not great. But she definitely is still a very good player. She was definitely on the border of making the list here. I would say she was probably number 11 or 12 here. Jumping forward all the way to BB9, we do have Adam. And Adam is someone that I think his win is underrated. I do think his winning game is actually pretty solid. While he does have his relatively good social play here and there, I do think he is also someone that can come off as annoying to a lot of people. I think he's someone that can just pop off on people, and that's probably not the best thing when it comes to this player ranking. I also think strategically he, again, implements some good strategy, particularly in the end portions of that game, where he does pretty much manipulate Ryan into doing everything for his best interest. But at the same time, I think there were definitely points in the game where he does things that are pretty bad strategically, namely that final 6 round where he doesn't put James on the block initially. I think that's really terrible from a positioning standpoint. Now, I will say that I do think it definitely garners him the respect from James, to where James is a lot more likely to give him the jury vote at the end. But to be fair, he probably had it anyway against Ryan. Also him just straight up voting James back in too, which is also not great for his positioning in the game. Though again, I think that one can also be rectified in the sense that at least having James back in the game puts a bigger target back in the game that takes the target off of him. But still, I'm 100% sure that's not what he was actually thinking. So he has a very volatile social and strategic game. He's okay at competitions, but again, there's other people that are definitely a lot better than him. For me, he's a very middle-of-the-road player, but when it comes to the top 10 here, not really close to even making it on. And now we're jumping all the way to BB17 to talk about Steve. And Steve is someone that I really like his winning game. While it's not the most dominant or most impressive game in the history of Big Brother, to be honest, in many ways, it's the way that I see myself playing the game of Big Brother, where you very much play under the radar for a good chunk of the game, build a very strong bond with one particular person, him with Vanessa, to where Vanessa takes him to the final 3 thinking that he's going to take her to the end, and then you cut that person at the end. It's a game that's very reliant on you being at the bottom of your alliance, to where the opposition never targets you because you are on the bottom, but also makes it so you have almost no real power throughout a lot of the game. But really, for me, that's a positive for a player ranking. I think the thing that knocks Steve down as a player is him being Steve, is the fact that he is this very socially awkward guy, and he has these really awkward conversations throughout the season with like Vanessa, with Devon, with numerous people there that I do feel like harms his consistency within the game. I think in most scenarios he gets targeted right off the bat. I mean, we see him actually get nominated that first week. And while he wasn't the target there, I do think there was a chance that he accidentally goes home had the veto gone a certain way. And I feel like that's just the type of player Steve is. I feel like he's a very high variance player. I think if he's someone that's able to get to the back portion of the game, I think he knows the optimal strategic moves that he needs to make to get to the end. I just don't know if he gets to that point most times. So while I probably have more faith in Steve strategically than, to be honest, most of the people on the actual top 10, I don't have as much faith in him actually getting to the end portions of the game most of the time. So he isn't on the top 10 for me. Next up, moving to BB19, we have Josh. I mean, come on, Josh was not anywhere close to making the list. He's actually the only winner that was eligible for this list that was 100% right away a no. Like, never putting Josh on this top 10. Again, like, Josh's winning game, again, I've said this before too, I don't think it's as bad as people say. It's not good, but I do feel like he had more agency in the back portions of that game than people give him credit for. I mean, as a player, though, I mean, I think he's so much worse. I mean, he is someone that can win competitions. I mean, at least there's that. I mean, socially, he is someone that, like, does get along with his group. He does have the ability to build a core group of people that will be loyal to him. And I think in that aspect, like, that is somewhat impressive. Again, for someone that has the personality that he has, where he just yells at everyone, gets upset at most people for the most ridiculous things, the fact that he can still have this very core alliance on the season BB19 that we saw, and we've seen him play the challenge afterwards, where he kind of has this similar sort of social game there as well. Strategically, I mean, it's tough. It's tough to really gauge how he is strategically, because I feel like so much of his strategy is based off of his emotions. I feel like when he takes the time to actually sit down and think about things logically, which we do see at points within BB19, I do think he has the strategic mind for the game. It's just that he's so clouded by emotions that he's not able to see the full picture most of the time. Again, at the end of the day, I don't look at Josh as a good player. He wasn't really anywhere close to making it on. And the last person we're going to be considering here as the honorable mention, again, was very, very close to making the list. Actually, on my initial draft of the list, this person was on. But the more I thought about it, I did swap this person out, and that person is from BB21. We do have Jackson. And Jackson's someone that, again, is so tough to gauge, because I feel like when you think about his game, he is really good at all three facets of the game. He is very good physically. He wins so many comps during that season. He is pretty good strategically. I won't say he's like this mastermind by any means. I think he's another one of these people that gets clouded by emotion at points, but for the most part, I do think he recognizes his optimal move at most points within the game. And socially, I do think people don't give him enough credit, where during the first half of that season, he was actually pretty good. The reason he's not in the top 10 for me is just because I think it's somewhat similar to Adam, in the sense that I just feel like he's a very volatile presence, both strategically and socially. I mean, socially, obviously we see him get into confrontations here and there. I do think he is someone that doesn't play the most consistent social game. And strategically, I feel like there's also points where he doesn't really grasp the full picture. Though, to be fair, I mean, he is someone that is so good at comps that he's able to rectify that. And that is why he almost made the list. However, I just felt like there was another person that I swapped him out for that is a more playable option during the majority of the game. And I think something else we got to mention here is that I think during certain seasons, I think Jackson probably loses to a bitter jury as well. I think Jackson's gameplay style doesn't work on certain seasons. I do think he got somewhat lucky with the cast that he was given, in the sense that that cast was coming immediately after BB19 and BB20, two seasons that had quote-unquote bitter juries, and especially with the last one being BB20, where Tyler was a fan favorite that lost to a bitter jury. So I think this cast came in with the thought that we can't be this bitter jury, and I think that greatly benefited Jackson as well. So really, at the end of the day, I just have too many hesitancies with Jackson's game as a whole, so he didn't make the list for me. Now on to the top 10 itself. We do have 7 remaining one-time winning players. That means 3 of the people on this list are people I've already talked about in previous videos. I've actually talked about those same players on my non-winning player list. So we're not going to really run through those in as much detail. We're kind of just going to be talking about them in comparison to the rest of the list when we get to them. At number 10 here, we do have the person that I swapped out Jackson for, and also another really recent winner from BB20. We do have Kaycee Clark. And Kaycee is really tough for me to assess, because I do think her winning game is pretty poor. Like, while she was in the majority alliance for a lot of the game, she didn't really do much within the majority alliance for most of the game. Really ends up just lucking out on the season, the fact that Tyler, who does end up dominating the game, ended up picking her as his ride or die, plus also the fact that a lot of the endgame competitions greatly benefited her, even more so on this season than it would typically. Which, to be fair, is also a fault of Jackson that I didn't really mention. Now, obviously, the Tyler thing, I mean, I think you have to give her some credit that she was able to get Tyler, who supposedly actively went to her to build this final two, to get someone like Tyler to do that. I think you got to be a certain type of person. She was obviously the right person for that. So I think that is something you have to give her some credit for. But really, the thing that left her off of the top 10 initially for me was the lack of a killer instinct. The thing about Kaycee is I feel like she's the type of person that is going to remain loyal all the time, not really even doing anything to undercut her opposition. I mean, there's never a point within the game where she tries to lessen Tyler's positioning within the game. That literally never happens. And we see in these truly great players where, despite them being loyal to their final two partner, they always try to undercut that person in terms of jury chances. And I don't feel like Kaycee ever really does that. I do feel like Kaycee also just gets really lucky in terms of the jury votes that she gets, with some of those votes coming from misconceptions about her game. Now, obviously, I do very much question if she's going to have the killer instinct to get to her ideal scenario at the end. But to be honest, I don't think most of the time it matters. I think Kaycee is just such a likable person. She's a very good social player, to where I do feel like she naturally wins most jury vote scenarios anyway. Plus, also, she's just very good at comps. While I do think that endgame comps greatly benefit her on this season, I mean, I do think she's just generally good at comps. And I do think that's also just a good way for her to gain respect from the jury by the end of the season. So really, at the end of the day, I just have a lot more confidence in her as a player to get further in the game, to win the game, than someone like a Jackson. So she lands at number 10. At number 9, we have a winner that I've said this, that I think her winning game is one of the best games in the history of the show. But as a player, I have so much hesitancy with her, and that is Maggie. Maggie is so tough to assess. Maggie obviously ran her season. She was able to get this group to follow her like a cult, where she was able to utilize Eric's eviction as a way to keep her group together and to remain loyal to her specifically. And I think that's very impressive. I think from a strategic standpoint, I do think she is one of the best winners in the history of the show. But, I mean, there's some flaws here. I mean, first up, I think when we look at the physical aspects of the game, she rarely wins comps on this season. I believe she only wins one HOH, one veto. She's the only winner to be shut out of part 3 of the final HOH. And again, as a winning game, I find that actually more impressive. As a player, I feel like that does show her lack of comp ability, which would obviously greatly benefit you in certain situations. Obviously, like, again, the way that I assess players is how well they would do consistently. And I do think without the strength in competitions, I feel like your consistency does go down a bit. Also with Maggie, I think socially she left some to be desired, especially when it comes to our opposition. I think within her own group, she did a very good job, obviously. She, again, kept her group loyal, still made them want to vote for her at the end. But, I mean, her opposition, I think she treats pretty poorly. I mean, people like Janelle, people like Howie, like James. I just feel like those people are people that really did not respect her by the end of the season. And I think there are scenarios where Maggie loses that final jury vote pretty easily. Again, like, if Maggie had been in the end against anyone but Yvette from her alliance, I do think she ends up losing the game. I mean, like, Maggie is someone that, again, I think is so good strategically, but has so many faults in the other aspects of the game that leave her relatively low on this list here. Again, I don't have that much confidence in Maggie on multiple appearances, despite how impressive her one appearance actually was. So because I don't really have the confidence to put her much higher here than number 9. Now at number 8, we're moving on to the players that were on my non-winning one-time player list. And actually it's all 3 of them in a row here at number 6, 7, and 8. But starting off number 8, we have Jason Guy, who is number 3 on that list. Jason Guy, again, I've talked about already. I think he is a very good social, strategic, and physical competitor. The biggest question for me is like whether or not he would still be able to demonstrate that ability if he didn't have a ride or die like he did with Danielle Reyes. I mean, if Danielle Reyes wasn't there, does Jason look at the game in the strategic lens that he did? Or was it Danielle that made him look at the game like that? I mean, at the end of the day, I do have a lot of confidence in Jason in the grand scheme of things, but again, like, I do think he is lower than the next 2 players we'll be talking about. And when we get to the top 5 players on this list, I feel like all of them are elite players in the history of the show, and I feel like Jason's just kind of a step below them. Now again, I did have him above Kaycee. I did have him above Maggie. I feel like he has more of a killer instinct than Kaycee. While I do think Kaycee's probably better in terms of competitions, and I do feel like they're relatively on par in terms of social ability, I just have more confidence in Jason's strategic ability than I ever would with Kaycee. And then when against Maggie, again, I just have more faith in Jason's physical and social games than I do with Maggie's. So while Maggie probably is the better strategic player at the end of the day, I do feel like Jason makes up for it with the other elements of the game. So that's why he's above them here at number 8. Now at number 7, we have Eric Stein. Again, problem here is that there's so many unknowns in terms of how he would play if he actually got to play the game. But what we did see of him playing the game as America's player, he played very impressively, where he controlled the entire house, had so many connections within the house, to where despite him being backdoored, he was still able to survive that. He was able to completely flip the power structure at the final 9, really on a whim. Like when America told him to do so, he was just able to do it just like that. Make an alliance with Dick and Danielle, flip around the power structure on Dustin, take him out, and hold that power structure together for the next few weeks. Now, obviously, the ideal move after that would have been for him to be able to flip back, take out Dick and Danielle. But even then, he wasn't allowed to do so when he wanted to at the final 7 after he had won the veto. And really, at the end of the day, I think if Eric had been able to play the way he wanted to play, I have so much confidence in the fact that he probably ends up winning that season. So for me, that was enough to put him above Jason, but still below the next person that we'll be talking about, because I do feel like there's still a lot of question marks with his game. So Eric lands at number 7. And at number 6, we have the top player from my non-winning one-time player list. We have Vanessa Rousso. And for me, I feel like Vanessa is very good at 2 elements of the game. I think she's very good at competitions. We see her win so many competitions on her season. I think that's impressive. Also, she is a master strategist within the game. I think she's the pretty definitive person in terms of Big Brother for me when I think of people who are almost solely strategists. Where I do feel like with most people when it comes to these social strategy games, a lot of the strategy and the social game is kind of mixed together, especially because you most of the time need a pretty decent social game to enact strategic moves within the game. However, I do feel like Vanessa is one of the few people out there that was able to get away with having weaker social bonds just because of how good she was strategically and how good she was at convincing players to do what was in their best interest. Now, I will say that I do think Vanessa was definitely benefited by the cast that she was given. She was given a relatively strategically savvy cast, and I do feel like if she was given a cast like BB16, BB19, I do feel like she would have struggled on those casts. Plus, also, I do feel like she, again, doesn't have much of a social game. Like, while she did make some social bonds here and there, I think her social game definitely left much to be desired and really left a lot of holes in her game that she had to fix through her physical competitions. She obviously had the blind spot with Steve as well, which is a lot of the reason why she's not a winner. So like there are massive downsides for her, but I do think most of the time when she's able to get through those first initial weeks, I think through her strategy and her comp wins, I do have a lot of confidence in her making it far into the game. She lands at number 6 here. And now we're on to the top 5. Again, all 5 of these people are winners that have only played one time as of right now. And actually at number 5, we have the winner of BB5, and that is Drew. And this is actually kind of tough because like when I did my top 10 player video for Big Brother, I actually had Vanessa above Drew in my assessments when doing those videos. But since then, I would say that I would actually have Drew above her. And that's because I feel like Drew is probably a lot more consistent as a player. I feel like Drew is someone that, again, is very good at all 3 aspects of the game. I mean, I think Drew is essentially the proto-Jackson, but just a better version of Jackson. Where I think Drew is obviously very good at competitions, won 4 HOHs on that season, which at the time was the record. Socially, he was really strong, where despite initially being on the outs because of his association with the 4 horsemen, he was able to reintegrate himself within the majority, something that the other horsemen were not able to do. And strategically, I feel like he really just has the killer instinct. I mean, we see him cut Diane at the final 3, really cold-bloodedly, and I think that's a very impressive element of his game. Also, the fact that he was able to drag Cowboy as far as he did, despite Cowboy never really integrating himself within the majority alliance. I think that's also impressive. I just really have a lot more faith in Drew as a player in the grand scheme of Big Brother than I do of any of the people that I've talked about so far. I think one of the biggest flaws in his game is the fact that he does just barely win. I mean, he only wins in a 4-3 vote. Mind you, 2 of those votes were from twins who are very pro-Cowboy, and the other person is from Nokomis, who was Cowboy's half-sister. So it's like, I mean, it makes sense that he loses those votes, but Still not a great position to be in, but at the end of the day, again, I have a lot of confidence in him as a player overall. So for me, he lands at number 5. Now number 4, we have the winner of Big Brother 4. We have Jun. I mean, I think Jun versus Drew is a big debate. I think it's very, very close. However, I decided to go with Jun largely because I have a lot more faith in Jun strategically than Drew. I mean, while Drew, I do think has the killer instinct to make the moves when he needs to, I feel like Jun is just a more well-rounded strategic player. I feel like Jun is someone that knows how to manage her perception with the jury. I mean, while she was someone that definitely was not loved by her jury, I think she's probably someone that probably ends up losing against almost anybody but Allison. She obviously played hard to get to the end with Allison, really worked on her relationship with Allison, and I do think she played the endgame portions of that season pretty optimally. As I mentioned as far back as with Kaycee, where I do think Kaycee lacked the ability to undercut her pretty obvious Final 2 opponent, I think Jun really did that in spades. I mean, we really see so many times where Jun allows Allison to look like the bad guy, because obviously she knows she's going to the end with Allison, and makes moves throughout the season to better her positioning with the jury against Allison. I also feel like Jun is just very good at making herself look like a bigger player than what she was. I think that's one of the biggest flaws of Allison's game, is that Allison tried to make herself look like this good girl sort of figure, and through that I do feel like there are many points where Allison might have been doing more than Jun, but Jun would be getting the credit for those moves, largely due to the fact that Allison mismanaged her jury perception, which again is a flaw against Allison more so than a pro against Jun, but I think Jun also recognized that that was the case. Now, the reason why I did consider putting her below Drew on the list though is because I do feel like she, one, obviously isn't as good in competitions. I think that's pretty clear. But also, I feel like socially, I do feel like Jun is someone that can rub some people the wrong way. There are definitely points where she does get on people's nerves, which I don't think Drew really ever did. But really, I do have a lot more confidence in Jun's understanding of the game of Big Brother and her understanding of people and how to maneuver around people, that I do feel like, just when thinking about it, I think of Jun as the better player than Drew. So for me, she lands at number 4. Now number 3, and the top 3 here are pretty definitive. I mean, I've talked about all 3 of these players multiple times now on my top 10 players of all time list, and they're all relatively high. Now the person at number 3 here, I believe I actually did have above the top 2 at one point. However, I did end up dropping him here. Number 3, we do have Hayden Moss, the winner, BB12. And for me, Hayden is essentially a better version of Drew. I think they are very similar players. However, I feel like with Hayden, I have so much more confidence in him as a player. I have so much more confidence in his actual game ability, which I do feel like there are some question marks with Drew. Again, physically, I feel like they're both about the same. They're both very good at competitions. They both won 4 HOHs. They won some vetoes. Socially, they're both very good within their seasons. I will say that I do feel like Hayden was probably better with more of the house than Drew was, where I do feel like there are certain people on the cast of BB5 that I don't feel like I have a great sense of how they felt about Drew. While with Hayden, I do feel like by the time of the jury, I do feel like he pretty much has a really good relationship with everyone there. And then strategically, again, I feel like they're about the same. I feel like the main difference is that since the season, I think from watching him on Survivor and from him like articulating his game after the fact, I have a lot more confidence in his overall game ability and his understanding of the game. And really, that's the thing about the top 4 players on this list. I feel like all of them are people I have a lot of confidence in them fully getting the game of Big Brother, fully grasping every aspect of the game. And I feel like Drew is someone I don't really get that with. So I mean, that's really the main difference between Hayden and Drew. And the thing that puts Hayden above Jun is obviously the fact that I feel like he's a lot more consistent. I mean, Jun, to be honest, is a much more flawed player than probably Drew. And I think really Jun versus Vanessa is actually a pretty big debate. But again, I have more confidence in Jun's understanding of the game, which is enough to put her above Drew for me, but not enough to put her above Hayden. I feel like Hayden is probably one of the more consistent players in the history of the show. I just very rarely see Hayden going home early. I feel like Hayden's going to be someone that makes it deep almost every time and probably has the comp ability to comp his way to the end most times anyway, and also have the respect from the jury. Obviously, on his season, he did almost lose. I mean, he only won in a 4-3 votes, but I mean, to be fair, I think those 4 votes were pretty locked for him. And really, 2 of the votes that he ends up losing are Brendan and Rachel, who are voting together no matter what. So, I mean, by mismanaging one of them, he essentially mismanages both of them. And then we obviously have Brittany, who would have voted for Hayden over anybody but Lane. So, I mean, while him winning in a 4-3 vote isn't particularly great, I do feel like there's a justified rationale for it. So I feel like Hayden is one of the most consistent players we will see from Big Brother. But the reason he's not higher on this list is because I actually do think the top 2 players on this list have a better understanding of the game than Hayden was. While I do think Hayden fully grasps the game, I do feel like the top 2 are 2 of the best strategic thinkers in the history of the show and are also solid all-around players. So because I do feel like Hayden's game knowledge is slightly less than those other 2, he does land here at number 3. Now number 2, and again, the top 2 here should be obvious at this point if you have seen any of my top 10 videos, but at number 2, we do have Andy Herren, the winner of Big Brother 15. Obviously, a lot of people like to discredit Andy by saying, oh, he was just a rat floater, he didn't do anything within the game, and I think people that say that just don't understand what Andy did on Big Brother 15, and I think there's even an argument to say that they don't understand the game of Big Brother. And what Andy was able to do is very, very difficult. The fact that he was able to pretty much stay in the middle of the house the entire season and still dictate the actions of the people in power for a lot of the season is really insane. I mean, the fact that he is one of the main orchestrators of the Nick vote, which completely flips the power structure of the game, but he is able to be the one to essentially tell Helen and Amanda to go enact the flip. And essentially, that is a lot of what he does in the early portions of the game, is that he manages his relationships with Helen and Amanda to where he has those 2 people out in front while he's in the background, allowing them to make the moves for him. And he's also one of the main people that wanted Judd gone, that started the movement to blindside Judd a double eviction. Yet again, we see that it's Helen and Amanda that enact that plan. We see him masterfully time his moves within the game, where he knows at Final 9 he needs to flip against Helen, then proceeds to flip against Amanda a couple rounds later, and is able to build the Exterminators alliance that allows him to run the end portion of that game. I think Andy is one of the players I have the most confidence in his strategic ability within the game. I feel like what Andy was able to achieve during BB15 is really incredible, and the fact that he was able to really perfectly time all of his moves, gather all of the necessary information to make the most optimal moves, while also being someone that was dictating the action in the background for the majority of the game. I think one of the biggest shames is that so many people don't really recognize what Andy was able to do, largely due to a lot of people just watching obviously the televised show and the show not really portraying him in this light for the majority of the game. And to be honest, between Andy and the person that's at number 1, it is very, very close. To be honest, so close that I don't even think it really matters who's at number 1, who's at number 2. I mean, the only reason I put the other person at number 1 is because I just find the other person's winning games slightly more impressive. But I think in terms of their overall game ability, I think they are very, very similar. So for very, very minute reasons, I do have Andy here at number 2. Now number 1, the best one-time player in the history of Big Brother for me is Derrick Levasseur. And again, for me, it's so close with Andy. I think they are really interchangeable. I think Derrick's game is more impressive from a dominant standpoint. Obviously, Derrick completely dominated his season pretty much from week 3 on. And even before that, he was in that Andy sort of position where he was in the background controlling things, managing the different sides. But again, unlike Andy, I do feel like Derrick put himself out in the forefront earlier and was still able to hold the control of the game the entire way through, which is so impressive. Again, I think Derrick's game is probably slightly more impressive than Andy's, which is the reason he's at number 1 over Andy. But again, I think in terms of their overall game ability as players, I feel like they are so similar that it's really interchangeable. Because to be honest, I have no doubt that Andy would have been able to do what Derrick did if he was put into the position to do so. But because Andy had the opportunities to lay back, he did, and he didn't have to demonstrate the amount of blatant gameplay that Derrick had to. So again, like for me, it's very close. They're pretty much the same in terms of my assessment of their games. Again, I think both strategically are incredible. I think they're both 2 of the best strategic thinkers in the history of the show. I think socially they're really good. Mind you, obviously in different ways. I think Andy is really good socially in terms of him just being this nice, playable guy, this guy that most people in the house get along with, and most of the people in the house end up trusting, while Derrick is someone that tries to blend in with the house and comes off as this like cool, relaxed figure, and I think tries to bond with people that way. Physically, I think they're both around the same as well. I think they're both competent in comps, but not really like the best person comps on their individual seasons. But I think overall they really are around the same spot for me on the list. Again, the only reason I have Derrick higher is because I feel like he demonstrated more dominance. But really, in terms of their overall game abilities, I have pretty equal thoughts on both of them. But with that said, Derrick Levasseur does end up being number 1 on my top 10 one-time player list. And yeah, that's the end of this top 10 Big Brother series to a degree. I mean, obviously, I'll definitely do more lists moving down the line, but this is the end of the videos that do mirror those that I did last year for Survivor. Now, I did end up doing a top 10 pre-merge boot list for Survivor. I would like to do the same thing for Big Brother sometime down the line, but it's not really an immediate video that I plan on doing. But obviously, stay tuned for the same style of videos moving forward. More Survivor, more Big Brother. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.